Hi, this is Marco Pimentel. Welcome to the podcast, Someone Like You. In this first season, you'll discover founders, creators, entrepreneurs, and business owners who are passionate about creating business models with lasting, sustainable climate solutions.
This, to me, felt like a way to have your salmon and eat it too. If you could make a high fidelity, nutritionally equivalent, delicious version of what nature's able to provide, maybe we can let the wild fish stay in the wild.
Sell cultivated salmon. With our global populations trending to nearly 10 billion by 2050, we have a major task to ensure that we can feed everyone. But we cannot feed everyone in the same way that we're doing today, as our environment really can't handle it. We need new, innovative, sustainable options. When it comes to seafood, specifically salmon, our options are to take from the wild populations, which have drastically declined due to a host of issues: overfishing, logging, hatcheries, climate change, or from farmed fish. Open net salmon farms options have not really proven sustainable, as they often result in harmful parasites to wild populations and typically use a 4-to-1 ratio, as in 4 pounds of seafood to produce 1 pound of salmon. There are improvements on land fish farms, insect food, but we need options that scale and don't put pressure on our wild stocks. And this is where Cell cultivated salmon comes in. It's really remarkable what has been produced, and Wildtype salmon might be the future of seafood. Look them up online and you're going to be in awe and wonder that this is not wild salmon from our ocean. Joining us on this week's episode is Justin Kolbeck, CEO and co-founder at Wildtype, a cultivated seafood brand on a mission to create the most sustainable seafood on Earth. Wildtype uses cellular architecture techniques that provides consumers with new options for real seafood that has the same nutritional benefits as a wild-caught fish, but without any contaminants such as mercury, microplastics, antibiotics, or pesticides, and without relying on commercial fishing or fish farming. Prior to founding Wildtype with friend and cardiologist Ayré Elfenbein, Kolbeck fulfilled a childhood dream of being a diplomat. His career led him to assignments in Pakistan, Australia, and Afghanistan. His exposure to acute food insecurity in Afghanistan left a lasting impression on him and convinced him that something must be done to reverse trends of global food insecurity. Wildtype is the first and only cultivated seafood brand to raise over $100 million in Series B funding, with high-profile investors like Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert Downey Jr., and Jeff Bezos. I hope you enjoy our fascinating conversation. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I call myself a self-proclaimed amateur fly fisherman, but I enjoy this sport. I've been a fisherman my whole life, but I am curious what your connection is to salmon or climate change, or what kind of drew you to the founding of Wildtype.
I wish I had such a linear connection to salmon as you do, but mine is a little bit more circuitous, I would say. So I started my career as a diplomat, and I worked in a couple wild places, Peshawar, Pakistan, and then later a place called Paktika, Afghanistan, which is actually not too far from Peshawar, just on the other side of the Durand line. And in both of those assignments, I came face to face with very, very severe food insecurity and starvation and hunger in a way that I hadn't before those two experiences. And for me, that set me off on this journey, an intellectual one at first, and then a very emotional one now, to try to find some solutions to some of these bigger issues. And I started learning a lot more about the direction and the trajectory of our food system globally, and quickly became convinced that we are on a crash course for a global food security crisis if we don't change our ways. And if you don't believe that, I mean, just think about how we would feed 3 billion more people by sometime during this century, all of whom want to eat a lot more like Americans and Canadians and Western Europeans in terms of the breakdown of their diet. And then, not too long after that realization, I started thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to start down this journey, where should we begin? And, we quickly landed on seafood as the place where we needed to start, because it is the number one source of animal sustenance or animal protein globally for our species. And then when you click it, one click deeper, the number one seafood consumed, at least in the US, is shrimp, and the second is salmon. And, we wanted to work with something that is very versatile, used in a bunch of different culinary traditions all around the world. And so that's how we landed with salmon. So that is the, I would say, intellectual part of the journey, kind of a deductive one, driven by a great deal of passion that I have. And then since then, we decided to focus on salmon 5 years ago. I have come to just really appreciate the role that plays. So I live in the Pacific Northwest, as you do, and that animal is inextricably linked to all of the things that I love doing on my free time, like hiking and camping and, kind of just generally being an outdoors person. And so I have really grown attached to that animal and its connection to the environment and the natural beauty of this part of the country and, part of the world, over time. So, it's certainly become in the last 5 years a much more emotional one for me.
And it's, when you think about salmon, obviously you think about wild salmon, and the connection there is that we're largely eating wild fish. And if you think about a lot of the other meats that we do consume, of course, that's being done through agriculture. And so you have this interesting combination between, over-resourcing wild species and then also trying to create a sustainable agriculture business with salmon as well, which we can, there's a lot of history there and what's good and what's not good. But I don't think that it's been figured out the good yet to do the salmon side. So you have an idea, and this is 2011 that you kind of spark a conversation with your co-founder and say, let's dig into this. How did that connection start?
Oh, yeah. So I met Ayré, 11 years ago. You're right, 2011 at a dinner. I was in graduate school, and he had just finished his MD, PhD program in Japan and at Dartmouth. And he was starting his residency in internal medicine at Yale. And we just happened to sit down next to each other at this dinner that a mutual friend had invited us to, and, really hit it off. And as you know, it's not all that common to make friends as an adult. And, I finally I was like, oh, I have this connection with this person. And, we became really close friends. And over the subsequent 5 years, we had talked about a lot of kind of big topics. I mean, this is, I guess, what a couple nerdy guys do on Saturday morning in New York, right? You just go to get together, have coffee, and kind of talk about these big things. And I think both of us had this unrequited passion for entrepreneurship that had budded super late in life. I mean, at that point, I was well into my mid-30s, and so was he. And we eventually started talking about the idea that would later become Wildtype, which kicked off in earnest in 2016. And I think for Ayré, who originally grew up in Australia and had seen hectares and hectares of rainforest razed to graze cattle, I think also had this, and meanwhile he was, at this point he had completed his residency in internal medicine and then later cardiology, and was working at the Gladstone Institutes here in San Francisco, where I am right now, and was working on growing beating heart cells for use in therapeutic applications for patients. And it was looking at this sheet of heart muscle cells literally beating and thinking, how much harder would it be to make meat? And so he had sort of pitched this idea to me, which, in 2016 I thought was absolutely insane for a whole bunch of reasons. But I was also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of obsessed with these big food security questions. And this to me felt like a way to have your salmon and eat it too, in a way, right? If you could make a high fidelity, nutritionally equivalent, delicious version of what nature's able to provide, maybe we can let the wild fish stay in the wild, right? And kind of keep these wild places as beautiful haven to sports people like you. So that's really kind of how it began. And we eventually kind of did our first pitch, which was to join a small incubator in San Francisco. It was kind of a pay by the hour thing, and Ayré and I funded it from our salaries basically at the time, and worked on this idea on nights and weekends for the first year.
And when did the initial idea kind of move into more of a, your initial I don't even know what you'd call it, if it's your initial prototype, or when did you move into the lab to say, let's start testing things?
It's funny. I had a meeting right before this, and somebody asked me when Wildtype's birthday was, and I was actually fortuitously just going back through some old emails, and I think it was November of 2016 when we did our first pitch, because this shared lab space I was telling you about was full, and they only had one bench left, and they were basically doing a kind of a pitch off to see who they would give it to. And so we had to make our first pitch deck, which neither of us had ever done before. And yeah, I think that's really when it started. We kind of threw our hat in the ring. We sort of won this little mini competition and started our lab work in the early part of 2017.
And Wildtype, what is it today? And I guess, you had an original idea to start structuring a cell-based salmon in 2016. What were those kind of, I guess, initial building blocks to create what is today?
Yeah, so there are a few things as it pertains to the underlying science that we needed to figure out in rapid succession. So the first thing was we needed to get a cell line going, and if you're not super familiar with what that is, it's not all that different from a starter yeast that can literally be passed down from generation to generation. So if you find the right type of cells, and you may have heard this term stem cells be tossed around before, all that means is that if you keep that cell in a healthy state, it can continue to grow and grow and grow, theoretically indefinitely. And there have been a lot of research on so many different types of organisms, certainly human, obviously, because we're self-interested to come up with good therapeutics to keep ourselves healthy, but also other animals like mice and, to a certain extent, primates and even domesticated animals for vaccine purposes. But very little had been studied on fish. And so we needed to kind of do that first, get this, kind of original starter yeast going for our first salmon cell lines. And that took a while. It took, the better part of a year to really identify that, because there was just nothing in the scientific literature. Once we figured that out, then we had to figure out what to feed those cells, right? So a cell, if you want to keep it healthy, has to think that it's in the human body. So it's getting the same nutrients it would get in our bodies, which is like special proteins and fats and salts and sugars. Not all that different from Gatorade, actually. It's a little bit more expensive to make, but so we had to identify what that cell feed would include to keep these cells really healthy and thriving. And then the last thing is we had to figure out how to take then those cells and structure it into the kinds of cuts of fish that we are all familiar with. And that led us down a third scientific discipline, biomedical engineering, basically, which is, the use of structural aids to help those cells eventually turn into something recognizable as meat. And so to do that, we actually hired some scientists to kind of work on each part of those things eventually. But in the early days, it was just the two of us reading scientific papers, trying things out in the lab, and just seeing what we could learn as quickly as possible.
And these initial cells, what are, I guess, maybe it's a naive question, but what are they based on? Is it based off of salmon originally?
Oh, yeah.
How does that?
Yeah, we actually just derived the cells from salmon that we actually got from the Pacific Northwest. So the types of salmon that we find there are like coho and chinook. We haven't worked with sockeye yet.
I see. And then essentially the ingredients to keep it happy are those, like, what type of ingredients do you use to keep that cell growing and happy?
Yeah, so it's kind of what I was mentioning. It's, if you were to take Gatorade and add a handful of other things, it would be very similar to that, right? So along with something to kind of keep the pH neutral, to kind of at a point where the cells are happy growing. So yeah, salts and sugars and all the amino acids, right? All 22 of them. All of those things go into that cell feed.
And when you started to get kind of early success on what a meat might look like, how did you make the decision around your brand and your branding? And I guess it's you see this with other the plant-based products where a farmer will butcher a cow, and then that goes into a market that then goes into the retail. But it seems like is the idea that Wildtype will become the brand to also the consumers, to the retails, to everything. How did you make that decision, or have you done that yet?
Yeah, that's right. So Wildtype is the name that we are going to kind of introduced to your everyday consumer. And, the idea was there aren't very many kind of branded animal proteins, very, very few. Obviously with the advent of alternative proteins like Impossible and Beyond, that started that trend. But if you like go in the seafood aisle, unless you're getting like Bristol Bay, or like Copper River salmon, right, that has, kind of a regional provenance to it, you're not typically going to be kind of brand aware per se. And we thought like, wow, there's this really big opportunity here to build a brand, not just to help consumers distinguish the fact that this didn't come from nature, right, or a fish farm. It was made in a different way, but also to communicate some of the benefits that this product will have, right? So, which I'd be happy to get into, but in short, it's the cleanest, most sustainable seafood on the planet.
And when we think about wild salmon and it's being a very clean, sustainable product, I guess people are probably wondering, how does it taste, and how does it feel, and the texture. Was that something that's obviously that you've been working on for the last kind of 5 years and iterative on? I think in an interview originally you said your first prototype tasted almost like nothing. So how did you go from that initial prototype and to what it is today? And for people obviously, listening, you can't see this, but if, you go to Wildtype and go to Instagram, for instance, it's kind of mind-blowing to see the product and to see people testing and tasting this. It's everybody that I've sent it to, they're all kind of like, wow, this is really interesting.
Yeah. So you're right. Those early versions certainly had some room for improvement, I would say. And part of the reason is nobody had really ever studied the intersection of cell growth and what you feed the cells and things like flavor, because there's never been a need to do that, right? This is completely unexplored territory for us. And so I would say, in terms of how it does today, in like a normal sushi context, like you show up to our little tasting bar, which I'm actually sitting in right now, and if one of our people who are handy around the kitchen were to make you a little omakase tasting of Wildtype salmon, I don't think you'd be missing much. It's really good. If anything, it's on the sort of milder, fresher side. So if you were to like, I've actually also had a chance to spend a good deal of time going fishing, when I'm out backpacking or camping, and if you like open up a salmon and eat it fresh, it's very similar to that. So like mild, almost like cucumber notes and like algal notes and oceanic notes, rather than that sort of like, pungent fishy flavor you get from stuff that might have been at the grocery store too long. And so, I mean, that opened up a whole new thing for us, which is like, what do consumers actually want? Do they want that like super fresh flavor that they might be unfamiliar with, or do they want something a little bit more closer to home in terms of like that grocery store experience?
Yeah, I being a fisherman, once in a while I'll take a fish home, and when you do, it's exactly that. It's very mild, very fresh. Does not have any fishy taste, is what people will say. So how, when you've got a brand, you got an idea, you're starting to build out this cell structure, how do you get that taste? Is it from things that you introduced into the product, and how long does it take to create a piece of salmon?
Yeah, so in terms of timing, it's just on the order of weeks, which is amazing considering that it takes a full salmon, a year to 2 years to grow to full size, let's say in a farmed environment. So we've got a big benefit there, right, from a throughput perspective. We can do a lot more salmon in a year than you could with the whole animal. Not to mention, our product is 100% yield, right? You don't have to worry about discarding things like bones and scales and fins, right, that maybe aren't so good to eat typically. So that's one thing that I think is a pretty significant and interesting difference. And in terms of like the flavor determinants, that's still something that we're exploring. One of the things that we've learned is that what we feed the cells actually has a pretty significant effect on how those cells taste. So that's something that I in full candor, I don't think we fully yet understand, but we are actively exploring right now.
And right now, cell cultivated meat market is obviously very new. There's no current FDA approval yet. What do you think it's going to take to get the final seal of approval?
Honestly, at this time, I think it's just a little bit more time. We've, at least in the US, been chatting with the US FDA here for years, many years now. And I think, we've disclosed everything to them, and we've had this very constructive, iterative feedback cycle. They'd ask questions, we'd answer them, we'd sort of tighten up certain parts of how we were thinking about the kind of typical food safety you'd want to find in any place, right? You don't want Listeria or Salmonella or E. coli cropping up in any food that you're eating, and some of those same risks apply for what we're doing. As well as just thinking about like, okay, well, we're making these fish cells in like a brew tank, right? That's very different from like cutting a fish apart on a table, right? So like, how do you apply the traditional way of thinking about fish safety, like in the food safety context, in this new paradigm? And I think that's been something that FDA has come a long way on, and just in terms of getting their arms around from a regulatory and like a food safety perspective. So I honestly think it's just going to take a bit more time to let the process kind of reach its natural conclusion. But I don't think we're years away anymore. I think this will all be happening soon, not just with us here at Wildtype, but a number of other companies in the space too.
Every week on Someone Like You, we dive into stimulating conversations with founders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and the likes who are consciously and successfully creating sustainable business solutions for the long haul. Tune in every week for a new inspiring conversation on leading climate solutions. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and a review. How does, when you think about salmon, either farmed or wild, there's a harvest, they take X amount of tonnage and they process it and, do whatever they do and ship it out to retail and people consume it. What does the facility at Wildtype look like, and what type of capacity comparatively to, I guess it's a hard thing to compare against, the normal way to harvest salmon. But what does your facility look like, and how does that scale, and what type of size kind of comes out of what your facility holds?
Yeah, it looks a lot like a very tidy brewery, actually. So a lot of big stainless steel tanks and the kind of equipment that we need to sterilize those and keep them clean in between runs. And then from a capacity perspective, it's kind of funny. We actually took over an ex-microbrewery space and repurposed a bunch of their tanks, as a matter of fact, at least for our San Francisco facility. It's kind of similar in reach, right? You're not going to supply every bar in San Francisco with a microbrewery volume, right? And from what we've calculated, we can make a decent dent in the sushi demand for salmon in San Francisco. Probably can't do all of it from this initial facility. But the idea was to really just show that this could scale, right? That we could have really big tanks and we can start to automate this and, produce it in a way where, a couple years ago when this was just happening like on a tabletop, now we can see it in sort of like full food production mode, right? So that's kind of the moment that we're in as an industry. We certainly haven't scaled. We're not sort of like even close to being able to make even the tiniest splash in this giant ocean of seafood demand, but we're quickly growing as quickly as we can.
You recently successfully did a Series B raise for about 100 million. How is that for this kind of stage of automation and scale, or is that also for, hopefully a check mark from the FDA approval and starting to get this into what might be a kind of go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So, we opened, I think, the country's first functioning cultivated meat facility here in the United States about a year and 3 or 4 months ago. It's very small though. It's like 5,000 square feet. So we built a second one just down the street in this old microbrewery, like I was telling you about. It's almost done, which is a bit bigger and has more capacity. So and it's not cheap to build these kinds of things, as you might appreciate, especially in this environment with supply chains the way they are. That's the topic for another podcast, I think. But also, I think to make all of the changes and build the team needed to bring a product to market. So until very recently, we didn't have a production team because we weren't kind of getting ready to produce. And so we, hired an extremely capable and fantastic head of production and ops who joined us from Cliff, if you're familiar with Cliff Bar. She's wonderful, and we're building out, a fairly decent sized production team now. And I'm actually watching them through the glass doors on the production floors. I'm talking to you. We've, hiring QA people. So been this monumental shift in what has previously been just an R&D outfit that operated like a, kind of like a postdoc lab to a certain extent in terms of like how we ran the company. But it looks and feels different now, right? We're thinking about, okay, supply chains, are we going to be able to get all the inputs that we need, get all of those vendors qualified to make sure that, if something came up, we could trace things back. Things like that, right? That are much more operational in nature and would be familiar to people in the food world.
And when we think about just cultivating cells from fish versus, cells maybe from meat, is there an advantage to cultivating fish versus meat?
Yeah, definitely. So salmon anyway are cold-blooded, so they will grow at room temperature versus like if we were to make a, Justin burger, you'd have to grow it at our body temperature, which is 37, right? And so you basically have to keep the cells in an oven effectively, unless you're in a place like Phoenix where it's at temperature every day. So we have a huge benefit, right? There's all of that heating that we just don't even have to worry about. And the cells can also tolerate a pretty wide range of temperature fluctuation, which is not typically the case for most warm-blooded organisms. So that's at least one, pretty significant advantage, I would say, over, let's say, poultry or beef.
And I don't know if you would be doing the study against, comparing wild or farm salmon versus a wild type, but have you done any early research or any studies to just around, I guess, the difference of the environmental impact of, a pound of wild type salmon versus a pound of, wild or farm raised salmon?
Yeah, we have. So there was a study done in Nature last year, the scientific journal, and they had quantified the greenhouse gases associated with deep sea trawling, which is how a lot of fish is actually created, as being equivalent to the carbon emissions of all of the airplanes on the planet combined, which was kind of a gobsmacking discovery, because a lot of people, when you think about climate change and global warming, you think about cows belching methane. You don't think about this, but I mean, it makes sense. And the reason is our oceans store 93% of the planet's carbon in the soil under the ocean, right? So when you're dragging these huge nets across the ocean floor, you're disturbing these particulates, which then sort of make their way to the surface and then, back out into the environment. So I think we will have an easy time doing better than that. The question, I think, remains at scale, when we are fully efficient and have built in all of the kind of regenerative closed loop systems that we are envisioning, will we be cleaner than the super sustainable, locally caught, small scale fishermen? And that is the bar that we want to hold ourselves to.
Yeah, and I think when you just mentioned the trawler kind of going and scraping the ocean floor, I think what people need to realize is these things are like the size of, I think there's a quote that almost 747s can fit inside these. So they do an unbelievably amount of damage, not only to bycatch and everything else. So I'd love to kind of get into this conversation of just wild salmon and farm salmon and wild type, and you just mentioned it. I love that you are talking about setting the bar against a fisherman that is sustainably catching a harvest on a stock that is sustainable at sustainable levels, and that is your bar, because that is the right type of bar. What are your thoughts on the wild or the farming salmon industry right now, and how can that provide for our food needs? You talk about food security in the beginning, and I think that's what people need to people realize. I think you've kind of called that to it, is our population is going like crazy. People want to have more proteins that are better for them and eat like North America and Europe and the such. So can the current system, do you think the current system can handle it? Do you think it's going to be an evolution in salmon farming, or what do you think about that side of the industry?
No, I don't. I don't think nature can handle it. And farmed and wild salmon are inextricably linked. Well, wild fish, I should say. Still, unfortunately, a great deal of the feed used in farmed salmon comes from wild caught fish. Depends on who you ask, but at least a third, which is a huge amount of sardines and anchovies and other things being ground up into fish pellets to feed salmon. But taking a step back, if you look, the FAO does this great state of the world's fisheries every, I think, 2 to 3 years. And they have this wonderful chart in there that shows the percentage of seafood globally that is within biologically sustainable levels. And about 30 years ago, that was close to 90+%. Today, it's only 2/3. And it is definitely on a downward trajectory. And this is while we have instituted over that period of time, basically fish farming as we know it today, not just in salmon, but in tilapia and shrimp and a million other things that we eat. And so despite the rise of fish farming, we are still seeing wild fish stocks globally across the world going down. So we're not on a good trajectory from a wild catch perspective. Taking it to salmon specifically, I'm a dated nerd, so I actually looked at what I would consider a leading indicator of supply versus demand, which is global inflation trends. I looked at US data in this case versus that same data, but for salmon prices. And what you see is that starting about 15 years ago, salmon prices far outstripping global typical inflation levels, to the point where now salmon is 5 times more expensive in real terms than it was a decade ago. And so what that tells me is that demand is increasing faster than supply can keep up. And it makes sense, right? Because there are only so many fish in the sea. There are quotas, certainly, to kind of help keep things sustainable, but they're definitely bad actors. There's just this great piece in the New York Times last week about Chinese fleets off the coast of South America, basically invading countries' fish stocks, and technically in international waters, but of course fish migrate, so that's just a bunch of BS. They're stealing from other countries effectively. And then from a fish farming perspective, regardless of your feelings about the sustainability of that, they are also struggling across a number of fronts. Most notably, due to climate change, in the northern hemisphere, it's getting harder and harder to keep fish healthy because waters are warming. And the warmer waters get, the more susceptible these fish are to sea lice and other things that are just nasty and find their way into our food system, which nobody loves. So the bottom line of all of that is that supply is fixed, if not shrinking, and demand is growing dramatically. So if we don't find a new source to insert here, one of the world's healthiest foods, which is salmon, will just become further and further out of reach for many people. And I think if we play our cards right, and we have cultivated salmon, like what we're doing, plant-based alternatives, more sustainable fishing practices that bring supply and demand into harmony with what Mother Earth can provide, I actually think we have a chance to reverse these trends if we act now and we don't mess around for the next decade. So that I think that is right there really the source of energy that is powering this company today, is to try to make that difference now while there's still time.
I think I hope and I believe that salmon and other types of seafood, they're incredibly resilient. And I think that if we allow them the opportunity to flourish and rebound, they will. It might take time, but it doesn't need a ton of time. And I think what's exciting about what you're building and what your team's building at Wildtype is that, a lot of the entrepreneurs that I speak with, it seems like often a lot of the success comes with a choice or an alternative that doesn't feel like it is a negative choice or an alternative. Like in your case, the salmon tastes really bloody good, and it's not something that people would be feel like they're they're having to make a different decision because of what they want to do. And I think those are the type of solutions that we do need to give our wild stocks a bit of a break. And one of the things that I love about Wildtype's brand that you're obviously building and you're trying to nurture right now, obviously ahead of being in into retail stores, and is that you do connect a lot with wild fish and wild salmon. And one of those places that you've done some work to protect, and there's a lot of heat and information on Bristol Bay, Alaska, for example. So how does Wildtype get involved with these type of environmental initiatives?
Yeah, so this is an interesting time where ourselves and I think what a lot of people would see as our competitors, like wild fishermen in the Bristol Bay, are completely aligned, right? So for those of you who don't know, there's a big planned open air copper and rare earths mine called the Pebble Mine, planned for the headwaters of the Bristol Bay, which is the site of the last remaining truly healthy wild Pacific salmon fishery in the world, right? We've pushed Atlantic salmon to the brink of extinction where you can't legally fish them wild anymore. And, the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and a number of other groups have very clearly said if this mine goes in, it will destroy that fishery, perhaps forever. And that is not the world we want to see, right? For all the reasons we talked about earlier. And so there was this initiative underway led by the Conservation Fund, which is a fantastic organization. And basically what they do is they purchase land, put it under a conservation easement so it can't be developed, and it's preserved for all time for sportsmen to enjoy. And this is like in this hyper-partisan moment that we were in the US, just this thing that feels really good because it doesn't matter if you liked Trump or Biden in the last administration. I think we all, at least as Americans, and I'm sure Canadians feel the same way, love our wild places, right? Whether you want to hunt or camp, like that crosses ideological lines. And, they had this effort underway with one of the local native corporations up there to purchase this land and protect it forever, rendering the mine basically impractical from what everybody can tell. And, they needed some help raising a little bit of extra money. So we raised our hands to try to help them with that. And we're very much in the process of that. So, if anybody's listening and wants to get involved, please email us at hello@wildtypefoods.com. And we'd love to get you introduced to the Conservation Fund to help with this effort, because this is this moment where we have to really put a stake in the ground and say, we're not going to let this environmental catastrophe happen. We'll find another place to mine these incredibly important parts of our economy's inputs that aren't going to destroy this precious resource that we have in wild salmon. So that's how we got involved.
Yeah, I just finished a book called Stronghold, and it was about the founder of the Wild Salmon Foundation, which I think they're based in Seattle, and they're talking about Bristol Bay being this stronghold, right? And lots of places in the world, there's only a few of these where it's really untouched, and really these places have to be protected. So we've talked a lot about what has taken you to kind of get to where you are. I'd just love to understand, I guess, just any of the, what are your current challenges with Wildtype? Like, I think, entrepreneurs or people that are listening, there's, you've raised a lot of money from some really impressive investors and a group of investors. You've created what looks like could be a scalable product that has some really fundamental changes. What are the challenges?
Couple things, and I think they're both related to commercialization and evolving from a principally R&D focused organization into a food production one. The first one is, I think, similar to an artist's conundrum, which is, when is the piece of art ever done, right? So we are constantly improving our product because we building it from the cell up, right? So there's just limitless things to explore and ways to make it even better. And at some point, we need to kind of put pencils down and get ready to ship a product, right? And lock in formulation and move everything into production. And I think that is a moment that we are very much in right now, which is, on one hand, our scientists saying, but wait, we've got these 3 things. And if we just had, 3 more months, it would be a million times better. And then kind of the commercial and operations part of the organization saying, well, yes, but like in order to be able to ship a product 3 months from now, we need to lock it in, right? And so it's just kind of this will be familiar, I think, to a lot of people. There's this kind of classic quote, if you're not embarrassed by your first product, you've shipped too late, right? So I think a lot of entrepreneurs would probably identify with that. But that is definitely, the moment that we're in this week in October of 2022. The second one is somewhat related, which is just building the muscle to be a food production company. I mean, it is like we're building a sister company to Wildtype, right? I mean, still the majority of people here are scientists and are focused on, making our products taste better and cost less effectively. And now we have production types in here and like food quality experts, and it's just like a different group of people. And obviously everybody's motivated by the same mission, so we all love each other, but it does feel like a company within a company to a certain extent. So along with that goes a lot of growing pains and growth and all of the good stuff that people typically associate with early stage companies.
And when you are ready to launch, everything's ready to go, is the plan to, natural type of health food, retail stores, restaurants? What's your kind of, what's the plan to do that?
Yeah, so because we're going to be effectively launching out of a microbrewery, we'll be a little limited in the quantities we can sell, and most grocery stores really want you to like pilot in 10 stores, right, and not stock out at all. So we're not ready for that. So we are focused on restaurants, and that is also kind of a cool opportunity, right? Because we're making sushi grade salmon. So if you go to like a sushi restaurant, is this moment where you are typically in this exploratory mindset, right? You like show up at the omakase counter and the chef kind of decides what you're going to have for dinner. And this is just another option that I think folds nicely into that when a lot of people are kind of up for trying something new anyway. So it felt like a very sensible place to launch our products.
Yeah, and it's a great marketing initiative too, because you people will be able to see the brand on on a menu and get to taste it and talk about it, and so I could see that working. So we're at the end of our time. It's been obviously a lot of fun. I did just have one kind of final question. I'm a huge fan of the book The Lorax. I give it out often. I read it to my children, and I think it's Dr. Seuss kind of called climate change 50 years ago when he wrote this book, and it's just overuse of our resources. And with it's quite fitting with Wildtype and salmon. We are absolutely overusing our resource of what's in the ocean. And so at the end of the book, the child gets a seed, and what can that child do with that outcome? And so a lot of people are, especially in the business settings, always just asking like, what can they do? Or maybe that entrepreneur is thinking about starting a business that is in climate or focused around sustainability. And so if somebody were to ask you, what would you say that first step should be?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this lately. So the wealthiest man on the planet, Elon Musk, is also one with a colossal environmental mission, right? But I don't think he would have sold any Teslas if they were terrible cars, right? He made the first car was this like monster of a car, the Roadster, right? It was like faster, cooler, safer, better speakers, right? Like higher tech than anything else that had ever been envisioned. And oh, by the way, it's an electric car. So forget about those emissions. And I think for entrepreneurs kind of in the environmental space, this is kind of how we've thought about salmon too, which is like, how do we make something that's better? Like, wouldn't it be great if you didn't have parasites or mercury or microplastics or antibiotics in your salmon anymore, right? That is a superior product, regardless of how you feel about the environment. And I think too often environmentally focused entrepreneurs want to lead with the environmental credentials. But in fact, I think we just need to make badass products and have the environmental thing be a secondary add-on benefit. Make it easy for people to vote for the climate, I think, is what I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Well, that's very very well said. And there's a tracker that you can track to see where we're on pace for our kind of 2050 goals. And one of the ones that we are on pace for is electric cars. And I was just reading an article this morning that people are buying a second electric car because driving electric cars is actually really great. I prefer it. And so I think that what you said is a great takeaway for people. And so how can people find Wildtype? Go online, check out the website. How would people find you?
Yeah, definitely. So our website is wildtypefoods.com, and all of our social handles are the same thing. So Wildtype Foods on Insta, Meta, if people are still using that, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc.
Justin, thank you. I'm super excited to follow your story and your team. You guys are building a really, really impactful business, and I am excited next time in San Francisco to try your Wildtype salmon. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Marco.
This podcast is co-produced with The Brand is Female. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Someone Like You. And if you did, please share this. We're a new podcast, and I would love it if you could share it with a family member, friend, colleague, work colleague. Share it on Slack, whoever you do. Just share and spread the message of these incredible brands. Please also support these type of companies. They're doing the hard thing, and the hard thing often takes a lot of people to get on board. And don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and review. I'm Marco Pimentel. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on Someone Like You, you can find us on Instagram at Someone Like You Podcast with all the links to the podcast, our website, and more information about the brands that we feature. Thank you again.